candidate. They helped him win the nomination and the presidency. To accomplish this purpose, they mobilized the money power of the Wall Street bankers and the media controllers.
Carter thus received the nomination. A similar process has anointed campaigns of other major party presidential nominees of the last few decades.
The people have no real say, including in who is elected to office in this country. I mean, consider this. In the United States, about 50% of the population are no longer affiliated with Republicans and Democrats. So 50% of the population is not voting for Republicans or Democrats. Tell me which national election, member of the House, member of the U.S. Senate, a president has been elected in the last 100 years who was not a member of one of those parties. Now, how is it possible that half the country isn't voting for Republicans or Democrats because they're not affiliated with those parties, and yet those are the only two options that we still have? I mean, I think that demonstrates to people how corrupt the system is, because you are literally kept from having any other option and any other choice.
Because of the manipulation of the mainstream media, public education, most of the entertainment world, as well as the political world, so many of the American people are sedated, and they do not engage in the areas in which they could make a difference.
The good news is, I think we're hitting a tipping point where the people, you're now hitting critical mass, obviously, when you have 50% of the country that's no longer a part of it, where, it just takes a very small minority now to really push things in a different direction.
We had George Bush trying to get reelected, and John Kerry was his adversary, alleged. As it turned out, there was massive electronic vote fraud in one of the swing states, Ohio. It turned out that John Kerry actually won. It was given to Bush. A year or so later, there's a young law student down in the University of Florida, and John Kerry is speaking down there. And the law student had the cojones to go over and get in front of the microphone when they asked him, when they opened it to questions. And he asked John Kerry, how come he didn't make more of a squawk about this?
And he says you won the 2004 election. Right. Isn't that amazing? Isn't that amazing? You won in 2004.
It was obviously he had won. It would have made the difference between not only him being president, but the different party would be in, and it was a very powerful question. You know what the response was? John Kerry gave a little nod or something, because the next thing we know, there's a goon squad of about 6 that come and drag the young law student right out of the auditorium.
However, the establishment has an even more powerful means of influencing the will of the people. The most important is the Council on Foreign Relations, or CFR, headquartered in New York City. Though virtually unknown to the public, the Council dominates cabinets of both Republican and Democratic presidents.
When you look at where the wires are connected to the centers of power, you will find again and again that places like the Council on Foreign Relations don't just float ideas, they provide solutions.
You often find members of the Council on Foreign Relations being appointed to various positions in government or industry, for that matter, and you see them in the revolving door going back and forth between business and regulatory agencies and stuff like that. The big question is, how substantive is the CFR on global affairs?
Since its founding in 1921, the CFR has produced 21 Secretaries of War and Defense, 19 Treasury Secretaries, 18 Secretaries of State, and 16 CIA Directors. And what is the Council's goal?
The Council on Foreign Relations is a fairly interesting entity to me. And the reason for that is because they have so many members of the CFR who are in media.
I think the CFR exerts tremendous influence over our government, our media, and our centers of education, more so than most people would want to admit.
The Council on Foreign Relations is a very important nexus point, but it's just a vehicle for the larger aims of those who have an agenda. But it's an important vehicle. It's a ring of power that is an engine to encircle the whole world.
Once in a while there'll be a spokesperson on major media, and he'll be introduced as such and so, and they'll give credentials, and then they'll mention a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. But that just, it sounds so innocuous. It just passes, oh, it's some council that deals with foreign policy, so people don't remember that.
The number one thing people need to know is that when you have so many members of media who are a part of those organizations or that organization, you have lost the ability to have anyone criticizing globalist agenda or globalist viewpoints because they are members of an organization that pronounces its view is to create, globalism.
They have seized upon foreign policy, economics, and trade to get around the bounds of the Constitution and put their global system on top of America.
When I wrote The Shadows of Power, the main concern I had was that maybe I'd gone too far in attributing our foreign policy to this invisible government. Now it's 26 years later, we've had the arrival of the internet, I've had access to information I never had access to at the time I wrote that book, and my conclusion is that it's not that I went too far, but I didn't go far enough. When the Council on Foreign Relations was formed, and the decision was made at a dinner at the Majestic Hotel in Paris in 1919, after the bankers got the word that the Senate had rejected the Versailles Treaty, so we weren't going to become embroiled in the League of Nations. So there was an organization created. It was in Britain, it was the Royal Institute of International Affairs. In America, it was the Council on Foreign Relations, like sister organizations.
These roundtable groups were put into formation to steer nations and steer their policies, rather than control them overtly through direct leadership. They worked through secret maneuvers. The Cecil Rhodes Secret Foundation Trust had been involved not in nation building, but in nation manufacturing in the southern part of Africa. And now they wanted the entire world.
Now, how do they control American government policy? The number one way is by serving as a recruiting ground, the recruiting ground for cabinet level positions. You've probably noticed that a lot of people in U.S. cabinets come from the big multinational corporations. How does that happen? Well, the Council on Foreign Relations will invite executives from Citibank or Exxon or Halliburton or Bechtel into the council. They'll attend maybe a study group, attend some dinners, hear some speeches by people like Henry Kissinger, Zbigniew Brzezinski. Now they become experts on policy, and now you see them showing up in the State Department or another major department. When you have one organization controlling the cabinet with a uniform viewpoint, whether the president is Republican or Democrat, naturally you're going to get uniform policies.
Here are some of the prominent members of the CFR, Council on Foreign Relations. George Herbert Walker Bush, Bill Clinton, Sandra Day O'Connor, Dick Cheney, Les Aspin, Colin Powell, Robert Gates, Brent Scowcroft, Jesse Jackson Sr., Mario Cuomo, Dan Rather, Tom Brokaw, David Brinkley, John Chancellor, Marvin Kalb, Diane Sawyer, Barbara Walters, Cyrus Vance, Paul Volcker, Henry Kissinger, George Shultz, Bruce Babbitt, Howard Baker, Samuel Berger, Elaine Chao, Dianne Feinstein, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, Chuck Hagel, Gary Hart, John McCain, George Mitchell, Bill Moyers, Jay Rockefeller, Donna Shalala, Strobe Talbot, Fred Thompson, Robert Zoellick, Richard Nixon, Hubert Humphrey, George McGovern, Gerald Ford, Jimmy Carter, John Anderson, Walter Mondale, Michael Dukakis, Al Gore, John Kerry, on and on. I mean, you notice first of all that you're talking Republicans and Democrats, conservatives and liberals. You're talking people in every area of government and news media. You're talking education establishment. You're talking basically the key establishment institutions of the country are all infiltrated with Council on Foreign Relations members. Why is this institution so powerful that no matter whether it's a Republican or a Democrat in the White House, they are going to fill their administration with members of the CFR?
Admiral Chester Ward, former Judge Advocate General of the U.S. Navy, was a CFR member for 16 years. Before resigning in disgust, he stated the Council's objective.
Submergence of U.S. sovereignty into an all-powerful one-world government. This lust to surrender the sovereignty and independence of the United States is pervasive throughout most of the membership.
This is a man who was also invited to become part of the CFR. and was a member for a few years until he recognized what the CFR was all about. After finding that out, he withdrew his membership from the CFR, and then he did his best to inform the American people as to what the CFR was all about.
The Council's journal, Foreign Affairs, has pushed for world government for over 90 years. In its first year of publication, 1922, it declared, "Obviously, there is going to be no peace or prosperity for mankind so long as it remains divided into 50 or 60 independent states. The real problem today is that of world government."
When you put all of that together, you recognize that the CFR, the Trilateral Commission, is nothing more but an elaborate attempt to, as they say themselves, make an end run around national sovereignty, diminish the independence and autonomy of the United States, and merge it into this global governing institution that they, of course, foresee themselves running.
My goodness, we're going toward everybody having a little bit and nobody having a whole lot, except for the elite. And we're going towards seeing all of our jobs taken away and put into another country. That's your world government for you. That's not benefiting the people in this country. So I absolutely, I abhor the idea of world government. And I'm afraid that what we're going to see is the demise of many of our countries in the attempt to formulate this one big structure.
And it's obvious to see, okay, there are these very rich and powerful people meeting at, under the guise of the CFR or the Bilderberg Group or a bunch of other things. But it really doesn't matter. The fact is the superclass exists. That's the problem.
So whether it's a Brussels, whether it's a World Trade Organization, whatever it might be, it's still built on the premise of how do we steal the most amount of money that we can, put it in the hands of the fewest, and tell everybody else what to do.
It's not primarily driven by political ambition. It's driven by economic ambition. And just the fact that I mentioned that might change the flavor of the conversation, because talking about economics is a little bit different than just talking about politics. And one of the reasons, again, that the American experiment here is not working too well right now as far as Congress is concerned is because Congress is not an economic animal, it's a political animal.
What is world government? Simply stated, one regime ruling the planet.
I don't think anything's intrinsically wrong with the one world government. In fact, I think obviously we are just one humanity, and eventually we're going to get to that. I can see perfectly well that there'll come a time when somebody's going to say, "Hey, where are you from?" You're going to say, "I'm from Earth." Okay? But the problem is, are we going to do this voluntarily? And are we all going to agree that we're going to have a world government and that we all have some sort of representation and the thing's done equitably and fairly, Or are we going to have a handful of wealthy, egotistical, sometimes psychopathic people who want to control the world who are going to foist it off on us? And unfortunately, this is what's happening right now.
I think what any subject of the New World Order would have to be concerned with is who basically is going to end up calling the shots.
Obviously, most people aren't thinking it all the way through. They have to realize that there's a difference between just saying we should have world government to put an end to war, and then asking the next question, but wait a minute, what kind of world government will this be? It might even be worse than war.
Countries act as a check and balance on each other. If one nation becomes despotic, another nation can rise up and stop it. If you had a one world government, it would set up the most unrestrained tyranny in history.
Already in the United States, with a population of over 300 million, you may be able to meet your representative, but your likelihood of knowing your representative as an average citizen is next to nothing. You may not even know who he or she is.
It only works in utopia. And so while this is something we might all strive for, without a massive shift in global consciousness, it's impossible.
Such a development is less remote than it may sound at first. It is being established progressively now. Modeled in Europe, where once mighty nations that oversaw empires such as Britain and Spain are becoming more like provinces of the European Union.